A boy whispered, "Mom, that's my real dad." The billionaire groom froze mid-vow. Part 1. The Wedding Day Revelation. The St. Augustine Cathedral had never looked more magnificent. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across marble floors, while hundreds of white roses adorned every pew. This wasn't just any wedding, this was the social event of the decade. Marcus Blackstone, the tech billionaire whose company had revolutionized artificial intelligence, was finally getting married. At 38, Marcus had built an empire worth $12 billion, but love had always eluded him. Until he met Sarah Chen, a brilliant pediatric surgeon whose compassion matched her beauty. Their whirlwind romance had captivated the media, and today, 300 of the world's elite had gathered to witness their union. Marcus stood at the altar, his navy Armani tuxedo perfectly tailored, his dark hair swept back with precision. His hands, usually steady when closing million-dollar deals, trembled slightly as he watched the cathedral doors. The organ began Pachelbel's canon, and the congregation rose. Sarah appeared like a vision in ivory silk, her grandmother's pearl tiara catching the light. But she wasn't alone. Beside her walked 7-year-old Tommy, her son from a previous relationship. The boy wore a miniature tuxedo that matched Marcus's, his sandy brown hair neatly combed, clutching the wedding rings in a small velvet box. Marcus had grown fond of Tommy over the past year. The boy was intelligent and curious, always asking questions about technology and space. Marcus had even started teaching him basic coding. Today, Tommy would officially become his stepson, and Marcus couldn't wait to legally adopt him. As Sarah approached, Marcus felt his heart swell. This was it, his new beginning. After years of failed relationships and women who only wanted his money, he'd found someone who loved him for who he truly was. Sarah had initially refused his expensive gifts, preferring quiet dinners and long walks. She'd even insisted on keeping her own apartment for months before moving in with him. The ceremony began with Father Martinez, who had known Sarah's family for decades. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Marcus James Blackstone and Sarah Elizabeth Chen in holy matrimony." Marcus barely heard the opening words. He was lost in Sarah's eyes, thinking about their future together. The honeymoon in Tuscany. The plans to expand his Malibu mansion to include a playground and pool for Tommy. Maybe even having children of their own someday. "Marcus," Father Martinez continued, "do you take Sarah to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or for poorer, for better or for worse, until death do you part?" "I do," Marcus said, his voice strong and certain. "And Sarah, do you take Marcus to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or for poorer, for better or for worse, until death do you part?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, but clear. "I do." As they exchanged rings, Marcus noticed Tommy shifting beside them, the boy's eyes darting around the cathedral. Tommy had been unusually quiet all morning, unlike his typically chatty self. Sarah had mentioned he was nervous about the ceremony. "By the power vested in me by the state of California and the Catholic Church," Father Martinez announced, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Marcus, you may kiss your bride." Marcus leaned in, ready to seal their union with a kiss that would mark the beginning of their new life together. The congregation held its breath in anticipation of this perfect moment. But just as his lips were about to meet Sarah's, a small voice pierced the cathedral's silence. "Mom," Tommy whispered, but in the acoustics of the sacred space, his words carried to every corner. "That's my real dad." The boy was pointing directly at Marcus. Time stopped. Marcus froze, his lips inches from Sarah's, his mind struggling to process what he'd just heard. The congregation began murmuring, confused whispers rippling through the pews. Sarah's face went white, her bouquet trembling in her hands. "What did you say, sweetheart?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible, though everyone in the cathedral strained to hear. Tommy, oblivious to the chaos he'd unleashed, spoke louder this time. "That's my real daddy. The man in the pictures you keep in your jewelry box. The one from when I was little." The wedding guests erupted in shocked gasps and hushed conversations. Cameras flashed as society photographers captured every moment of the unfolding drama. Marcus felt the blood drain from his face as the implications of Tommy's words began to sink in. He stared at the boy, really looked at him for the first time. The sandy brown hair that curled slightly at the edges, just like his had when he was young. The green eyes flecked with gold. The way Tommy's left eyebrow raised when he was thinking, a mannerism Marcus had noticed in himself in old photographs. The boy's hands, long-fingered and elegant, like those of a pianist, or a surgeon, or a tech mogul who spent hours typing code. "Sarah," Marcus said slowly, his voice cutting through the cathedral's chaos, "what is Tommy talking about?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears, her carefully applied makeup beginning to smudge. She looked between Marcus and Tommy, then at the sea of expectant faces surrounding them. 300 wedding guests, including senators, celebrities, and tech industry titans, all waiting for her answer. I can explain," she whispered. But Marcus was already stepping back, his mind racing through memories, trying to make sense of what was happening. 8 years ago, he'd been a different person, young, reckless, fresh out of Stanford with his first startup. He'd had a brief relationship with a medical student named Sarah. They'd dated for 3 months before she'd suddenly disappeared from his life, claiming she needed to focus on her studies. He'd tried to contact her, but she'd changed her phone number and moved apartments. Eventually, he'd moved on, throwing himself into building his company. But he'd never forgotten her, the way she laughed at his terrible jokes, how she'd fallen asleep on his shoulder while he worked late into the night, the dreams they'd shared about changing the world. When he'd met Sarah again a year ago at a medical conference where he was the keynote speaker, she'd seemed like a gift from the universe. She was more beautiful than ever, successful in her own right, and a devoted mother. He'd never questioned Tommy's paternity. Sarah had told him the boy's father was a fellow medical student who died in a car accident during their residency. Now, staring at Tommy's face, Marcus saw his own childhood reflected back at him. The boy wasn't just similar to him, he was his mirror image at that age. "The jewelry box," Marcus said, his voice growing stronger. "Show me the pictures, Sarah." The cathedral had descended into barely controlled chaos. Wedding guests were pulling out their phones, undoubtedly live-streaming the most dramatic society wedding of the century. Security guards moved to block photographers from getting closer to the altar, but the damage was already done. This moment would be splashed across every tabloid and social media platform within hours. Sarah stood frozen in her wedding dress, tears streaming down her face. "Marcus, please, not here. Not like this." But Marcus was beyond caring about appearances or social protocols. 8 years of lies, 8 years of being denied his son, if Tommy truly was his son, had ignited a fury he'd never felt before. "Here and now, Sarah," he demanded, his voice echoing through the cathedral. "Everyone's already watching. Tell me the truth." Tommy, sensing the tension but not understanding its source, tugged at his mother's dress. "Mommy, why is everyone upset? Did I say something wrong?" Sarah knelt down to Tommy's level, her voice breaking. "No, sweetheart. You didn't do anything wrong. You're perfect, just perfect." Father Martinez, clearly out of his depth with this turn of events, attempted to restore order. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion in private." "No," Marcus interrupted, his business persona taking over. This was a negotiation now, and he'd never lost one that mattered. "Sarah, I need you to answer one question, and I need you to answer it honestly, in front of all these people. Is Tommy my biological son?" The silence that followed was deafening. Even the photographers stopped clicking, waiting for the answer that would either make or break 2 lives. Sarah closed her eyes, and when she opened them, the woman Marcus thought he knew was gone. In her place stood someone who looked defeated, vulnerable, and terrifyingly honest. "Yes," she whispered. Then, louder, "Yes, Marcus. Tommy is your son." The cathedral erupted. Guests leaped from their seats, reporters began shouting questions, and security struggled to maintain order. Marcus felt like he'd been punched in the chest. Even though he'd suspected it the moment Tommy spoke, hearing the confirmation was devastating. 8 years, he said, his voice barely controlled. 8 years, Sarah. Why? Sarah stood up, still in her wedding dress, still holding her bouquet, but now looking like she was attending her own funeral instead of her wedding. I was scared. We were so young, and you were just starting your company. I found out I was pregnant after I'd already ended things between us. That wasn't your decision to make alone. Marcus's voice boomed through the cathedral. He's my son. I had a right to know. You were 26 and working 18-hour days. Sarah shot back, her own emotions finally breaking through. You talked about nothing but your company, your dreams, your plans to conquer Silicon Valley. There was no room in your life for a family. So you decided for me? You let me believe he was dead? Some phantom medical student who never existed. Tommy began to cry, overwhelmed by the shouting and the chaos around him. Without thinking, Marcus moved toward the boy, his parental instincts kicking in despite his anger. He knelt down and pulled Tommy into his arms. "Hey buddy, it's okay," he said softly, his voice gentle in a way that surprised everyone watching. "Nobody's mad at you. You didn't do anything wrong." Tommy looked up at Marcus with those familiar green eyes. "Are you really my daddy? My real daddy?" Marcus felt his heart break and heal simultaneously. "I think I am, Tommy. I think I've been your daddy all along, I just didn't know it." The moment of tenderness was interrupted by Sarah's voice. "Marcus, there's more." He looked up at her, still holding Tommy. "More what?" "More you need to know. About why I really left. About why I came back into your life." The remaining wedding guests leaned forward, sensing that the drama was far from over. Marcus stood up, lifting Tommy with him, and faced his bride, or ex-bride, he wasn't sure which. "Tell me everything, Sarah. All of it." Sarah took a shaky breath. "When I found out I was pregnant, I was terrified. But I was also relieved. I thought maybe it would give me an excuse to stay with you, to build something real. But then I overheard you talking to your business partner, Jake." Marcus remembered Jake Morrison, his first co-founder who'd left the company after their initial success. "What about Jake? You were on the phone with him, planning your expansion. He asked about me, about whether I was going to be a problem when you started traveling for investor meetings. And you said..." Sarah's voice broke. "You said that I was great, but you couldn't let anything distract you from building the company. That you'd probably have to end things soon anyway because serious relationships were a luxury you couldn't afford." Marcus felt like he'd been slapped. He had no memory of this conversation, but it sounded exactly like something his younger self would have said. In those early days, he'd been obsessed with success, driven by a fear of failure that made him ruthless in his priorities. "So I left," Sarah continued. "I decided to have the baby on my own. I moved to Boston, finished medical school there, and raised Tommy by myself. I told him his father was someone I'd loved who couldn't be with us anymore. It wasn't entirely a lie." "But why come back?" Marcus asked. "Why now? Why pretend you didn't know me when we met at the conference?" Sarah's next words hit him like a physical blow. "Because Tommy was diagnosed with a rare genetic condition 6 months before I met you again. He needs surgery, Marcus. Experimental surgery that costs more than I could ever afford, even as a successful surgeon. When I saw you at that conference, when I realized how successful you'd become, I thought maybe I could make you fall in love with me again. Maybe I could secure Tommy's future without ever having to tell you the truth." The cathedral fell silent except for the sound of Tommy's quiet breathing against Marcus's chest. Marcus stared at Sarah, trying to process this final revelation. "You were going to marry me for my money? For Tommy's medical bills?" "I was going to marry you because I never stopped loving you," Sarah said, her voice fierce despite her tears. "But yes, Tommy's condition made me desperate enough to find you again. The surgery he needs, it costs $3 million, Marcus. I would have done anything to save my son. Our son." Marcus looked down at Tommy, who had fallen asleep in his arms despite the chaos around them. The boy looked peaceful, innocent, unaware that his entire world had just shifted on its axis. "What's wrong with him?" Marcus asked quietly. "A rare heart condition. He'll need the surgery within the next 2 years, or—" Sarah couldn't finish the sentence. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 8 lost years, of a son he'd never known he had, of a woman who'd loved him enough to lie to him. When he opened them again, his decision was made. "The wedding is off," he announced to the still watching crowd. "Everyone can go home." Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I understand. I'll pack our things and—" "Sarah," Marcus interrupted, his voice softer now. "The wedding is off, but that doesn't mean this is over. Tommy is my son. That changes everything. We need to talk, really talk, about what happens next. About how we move forward as his parents." He looked around the cathedral one more time, at the flowers and the cameras and the shocked faces of society's elite. "But first, Tommy and I are going to get him that surgery. And then we're going to figure out how to be a family. Maybe not the family we planned, but the family he deserves." As Marcus carried his sleeping son down the cathedral aisle, past the abandoned altar and the scattered rose petals, he realized that sometimes the most important moments in life came disguised as disasters. He'd lost a wife today, but he'd gained something infinitely more precious: his son. Behind them, Sarah followed in her ruined wedding dress, and for the first time in 8 years, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, the truth would set them all free.